This is a Friday for Birds talk. I'm going to try to talk about the birds in particular. This is a lovely black-throated wattle-eye. This was on the cover of Audubon magazine. And they are wattle-eyes, so maybe 8 or so species, depending on how you cut them. They're only found in Africa, and they are sort of mid-story frugivore insectivores that have this bizarre wattle around their eye of skin that actually is loose. So I can't even, it's really actually even difficult to describe. But I can talk about just that for the whole hour. So I'll just go to the next slide. If I can do so. Okay. I was a Marie Curie Fellow, that's EU funding. Durham funded me. The Global Challenges Research Fund was big. EU Horizon 2020 funds my TROPIBIO program. Waterloo Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, that's Corinne Jarrett's PhD. She works with Ellie at the Swiss Ornithological Institute, and FCT fellowships as well for my BAT PhD student. And a little reminder for those of you who wouldn't mind, just muting your microphone, and I think I'll take questions at the end if that would be all right. Okay, as I share this breathtaking jewel of the forest, the African emerald cuckoo, I'll move on to the background information. So this here is a map of species richness in the world. And you can see that the brightest, reddest spots are also very closely aligned with the distribution of tropical rainforests in the world. And you can overlay them, and it's a very tight match. So if you're interested in conserving biodiversity like me, working in the tropical rainforest is an absolute no-brainer. Why would you do that? About half of the Earth's biodiversity on just 7% of the land surface. More than half of the closed canopy forests on the Earth have already been cleared, and that rate continues at roughly 7 million hectares lost annually. That's roughly 1 football field per second. So just since I've been talking on that slide, that's about 20 football pitches just since I turned to this slide. So pretty terrifying rate of deforestation. Doing better lately in Brazil, thanks to the regime change, but lots of issues and lots of heavy deforestation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So why did I become interested in working in Africa? In the popular media globally, when you hear about human population, what you always hear about is India and China. And only recently have we discovered that India and China are actually leveling off, and they'll level off shortly. But the population of Africa is really increasing exponentially. And so by the end of this century, there'll be 4 times more African people. And so that's going to create an enormous amount of pressure on natural resources. And I think I would be remiss without mentioning that women's education is probably, arguably, the thing that most strongly correlates with birth rates. So educating women, investing heavily in education is one of the best ways to protect natural resources, albeit seemingly indirectly. Okay, so a little more on human population growth. By the year 2100, Africa will have 6 of the 11 most populous countries in the world. The DRC will shoot up to number 6. Ethiopia will be way up there at 223 million. There you go, represent Ellie. Egypt will be absolutely enormous, even though the vast majority of the population is confined to the Nile Valley in this tiny little area. And Angola will have more people than Brazil, which that's the one that really blows my mind. I cannot wrap my mind around that. So tremendous changes coming during our lifetime, and that have already occurred, and there'll be immense challenges to manage the natural resources. So I think I'm preaching to the choir here on that one. And I'll move forward with this lovely Western bluegill, Spermafega hematina, that is, as you can tell by the enormous pearly bill, a wonderful seed-cracking bird that eats big seeds and also is excellent at destroying fingers if you happen to be lucky enough or unfortunate enough to catch one. So why study tropical birds? So much of my PhD was devoted to these topics. They're globally, whether they're related or not, understory tropical rainforest birds, the insects, they're among the first to decline when forest is degraded, and they're among the last to return when the forest regenerates. So they're really great indicators, sentinels, if you will, canaries in the coal mine for rainforest health. And so in Amazonia, as part of the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project that's in the middle of the Amazon near Manaus. You can see, can you see my cursor here? Yeah, okay, so these two guilds, the near ground insectivores and the terrestrial insectivores, those that walk along the forest floor, there was the ones that significantly disappeared from primary rainforest in the last 40 years. So not only do they disappear when things are cut, but they disappear when things aren't cut. So they're so sensitive that likely, we haven't proved this, but climate change changes the dynamics of the understory, the distribution of insects and fruit, and these animals are so sensitive that they're affected by these indirect effects as well. And we're working actively on that issue. So this is three completely unrelated animals from totally different families that look almost exactly the same. Myrmonis torquata, which is the most sensitive bird in Manaus, in that study system that I just mentioned, the log runner from Northern Australia, and gray ground thrush, in this case in Equatorial Guinea, but from Central Africa. All three are really sensitive. And I think it's no coincidence that all three are really lovely sentinels. They all have a really similar ecological niche derived to eat dark insects on the dark forest floor and walk around in that little microhabitat. So they are, in fact, the canaries and the coal mine indicators of species for all rainforest biomes worldwide is an argument that I'm increasingly convinced of this, and I'm dedicating much of my work towards studying this guild. Okay, so West Africa, this is of course Africa, and you can see the distribution of still existing forest in dark green here and destroyed forest in light green. You can see there's still a huge chunk of forest left in Central Africa that's intact. It's the second biggest chunk after the Amazon. And West Africa, huge parts conserved as an example, with the exception of big chunks of Liberia that still remain intact. Much of the Ivory Coast and Ghana have lost their tropical rainforest, primarily driven by agriculture. So that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in working in agriculture per se, because it's mostly this small scale agriculture that seems to be driving the deforestation in Africa. That's pretty different than what's happening in Latin America and Indonesia, where it's mostly like industrial scale stuff. Okay, so this is mainland Equatorial Guinea. If you look in the middle of the map, that EG, that's the mainland where we do most of our work. The green is forest. The yellow is protected areas. And let's see what else. So I want to zoom in on this little square here. That is a new capital city that Equatorial Guinea has decided to build on the mainland. It was previously a big chunk of primary forest. This is the landscape here. Green is forest. Blue is basically this city or the roads that they've cut, essentially. It's not finished yet. And these are our two main plots. Secondary forest, it's pretty disturbed, but closed canopy, and primary forest here, that's about 500 meters from the closest road. And this is a brand new university, Afro-American University of Central Africa, that we hope to be our base of operations for years to come. So back to the big map here, I would be remiss without mentioning that we're partnering with the Rainforest Trust, which is a big organization that basically funds the creation of new reserves. And I'm happy to report that we've been funded to create a new national park right here, right next to the new capital city, about 100,000 hectares. And it connects with two other existing protected areas to make the whole area 200,000 hectares, which is pretty exciting. And lots of really cool non-bird animals live there as well. Giant pangolin, forest elephants, our closest living relative, which we share roughly 99% of our DNA, the chimpanzee. Of course, the Western lowland gorilla, it's a big silverback here. And birds, good stuff. So part of what we're doing here is a really basic exercise to understand if birds in secondary forests, that's closed canopy, but disturbed, actually differ than the ones in primary forest. That kind of research hasn't been very well quantified in Central Africa. So we're trying to really nail down how the communities differ and specifically which species are most vulnerable, which guilds are most vulnerable. So this is basically an ordination plot. It like takes many axes of animals in this case, and basically smushes them onto two axes so you can see how the communities are different. You can see that the secondary forest community is pretty different than the primary forest community. Each one of these dots is a different bird species. And who are the canaries in the coal mine? The canaries in the coal mine are understory insectivores, as they are in the neotropics and as they are in the sort of Asian tropics as well. So in particular, Shapardia cyanothopsis is a type of accolade or forest robin type thing. It's this thing, and I don't think we ever caught it in the secondary forest, even though to the untrained eye, it looks almost the same when you're in the middle of the plot. So we can't really tell, but they can. Brown-chested leaf, Camitylus polycephala. This is a lovely ant-following bird that specializes in following swarms of army ants. I think in East Africa, they use the name sapu. Do I have that right? Yeah, okay, cool. That's the genus Doralus ant. There's a bunch of different species. I'll talk more about that. The black-capped Illidopsis, which is another sort of casual ant-following bird, one of the three species of Illidopsis that we have on the plot, all three of which are super sensitive. They're like impossible to see. They creep around on the forest floor and make very little noise. And the sort of king of the ant-following birds, or queen, if you will, the fire-crested Alif castanea. I think that was split from the West African one, Alif diademata. So these are the real canaries in the coal mine, the ones that even with just a small amount of cutting and manipulation of the forest, they start to disappear. Let's see. So who drives this pattern? It is the driver ants. And I'd argue that there is really no king of the jungle. It's certainly not the lion. It's in fact a queen, and it's the Doralus ant. And so these ants are out of this world. Again, I could spend hours just talking about this. These ants are the largest documented colonies of insects on Earth. Some of the colonies have up to 30 million individuals. If you've ever encountered a swarm of these things, you can step in an area, that's twice the size of a room, 3 times, 4 times the size of a room. And anywhere that you step, you'd be stepping on 200, 300 ants. And of course you get attacked from all angles. So they have a profound influence on the forest. They're ecosystem engineers. They sweep every meter of the forest floor about every 2 weeks. So you can imagine that without these ecological dynamics that this species set up, not only do you lose the birds, but you would fundamentally change the composition of the animal and plant community in the forest. So they're absolutely essential components to the sub-Saharan African fauna. So now I'm going to change gears a little bit into cacao, and the reason this is important is because it's a really dominant habitat in a lot of different landscapes, particularly in West Africa, but increasingly in Central Africa as well. This is probably because the climate has changed and the landscape has changed. So in Ghana, for example, and big swaths of the landscape have been totally converted from forest to full sun cacao. So the landscape gets less rain on top of global climate change. And so ironically, the habitat is less suitable for the crop that grows there. And now the system seems to be shifting to the DRC and Cameroon and other places where it's not as hot and dry. And so why cacao? About 73%, depending how you slice it, is produced in Africa. Before we started, there were 0 published studies focused on wildlife biodiversity and cacao in Africa. Traditional cacao farms retain 95% of the species richness, that is the number of species in primary forests. So for me, that was a big sort of reason for hope. Like, hey, these plantations, these farms, they can support a really rich animal community, so they're worth studying, as opposed to something like oil palm that arguably is really not helpful at all for a native ecological community. The native species that can use it are very, very few, and it's a completely different system than the full sun. The pollinator remains unknown, and 16 of the 20 per capita consumers of chocolate are in Europe and the United States. So, most of Europe, who funds my project, Europeans primarily are driving the consumption of chocolate, which means, and that's creating deforestation somewhere else. So that's the responsibility, I would argue, of the consumer in large part to help to mitigate some of the damage that's being caused. Okay, so as I mentioned, Africa, sort of unlike Southeast Asia and Amazonia, it's being driven by small scale agriculture. That's what's driving most of the deforestation. So it's a very different system. And thus, for me, studying small scale agriculture's effects is really important. So this first question is to ask the basic thing, is cacao good habitat for birds? So this is Corinne Jarrett's project as part of her PhD. She works at the Valley. We had 200 sites across Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea, 1,500 bird captures per each treatment. And we found that cacao is in fact, or cocoa is in fact very rich. This is basically species richness. And it's really quite rich, richer in fact than forest. Although when you look under the hood, the story is not so clean as that. So we're looking at 3 different habitats here: full sun cocoa on the top, shade cocoa, and primary forest on the bottom. A bunch of different guilds of birds that eat different things or have different sort of habitats. And we found that although the cocoa is rich, it's missing key components of the system, the most sensitive species. So cocoa is diverse, but it is not a substitute for primary forest, where you're missing these 2 guilds in particular. We're listing the little tree is forest specialist species, and the little ant is the ant following species, the same species that I mentioned in our previous study from Equatorial Guinea. I call those the canaries in the coal mine, right? The Chapardia, the Alethi, the other Alethi, and the Elodopsis. Those are our same indicator species as before. So we're seeing consistency among studies, which is nice. We're able to kind of replicate similar thing. And all of these species were almost completely absent from the cocoa, except for a couple of captures, a handful that were just on the edge of the Job Biosphere Reserve in southern Cameroon, which is a vast area of unbroken forest. So they probably just spilled in to the farms from that habitat. Now, next we wanted to look at ecosystem services. That is how do birds and bats in this case, how do they help to provide a service for farmers that coexist in this habitat? So this is a picture of Isamba Christian and his family, and you can see from this image that they're totally embedded throughout the food web, right? This his son here is actually eating the cocoa fruit, which if you haven't tasted, is delicious. They're processing the cocoa from the harvest, and so they're immersed in this food web. So basically, the sort of more sustainably they can manage the web, the better for everybody involved, not only in the ecosystem, but also for Isamba and his family. So if we're able to rely on nature, on birds and bats, to provide a service like eating pests, that's less fungicide, less herbicide, less insecticide that Isamba and his family have to spray on the cacao. They also save money this way. So we're looking for basically a win-win. So we also wanted to look at how nature helps pollinate the plants. This is the reproductive a cocoa flower, which is absolutely tiny. On one coin, you could fit 20, 50 of these tiny little flowers. So you can't watch what the pollinator is. You have to do this with some other fancy technique. And in this case, we used DNA metabarcoding. So basically, we took little pieces of the reproductive parts of the flower, put them into a test tube. This is way oversimplified. And then we sequenced the bits that are left to see which insect species are pollinating the cacao. So at the same time as working on birds and bats, we're also looking at pollination. And we find it's mostly gall midges that are doing the work, but also some biting midges and some parasitoid wasps. So previously what we thought is it's cocoa midges that's doing it all. And that's really not true. It's a whole community of insects that's doing the work. So basically, if you can manage the habitat to promote birds, to promote the right kind of insects, to promote bats, then you get a ton of service for free, basically. And then you don't have to apply pesticides and herbicides and insecticides to your plots. So it's a win-win-win, if you will. And we wanted to ask a basic question, which was, do birds and bats actually eat cocoa pests? We didn't know the answer to that. This is a different species of wattle-eye, by the way, the red-cheeked, which I don't know why you wouldn't call it the blue-eyed, the blue wattled wattle-eye, but you know, I don't name these things. Regardless, really, really incredible species that looks like a cartoon character. They all kind of do. As you can see, I have a soft spot for wattle-eyes. Okay, so we use DNA metabarcoding to get at the diets of these animals, and this is just one farm on one visit in 1 year. So you can imagine that, and we have samples from 4 years and 36 farms total. So the whole thing is a complete mess. This gives you an idea of the complexity of the food web. In this particular example, we had 2 birds and 4 different bat species. They're eating from across the spectrum of the arthropods. And yes, they do eat pests. This is the brown capsid, the most destructive cocoa pest in Africa. And we found 12 bird species and 6 bat species where the DNA of this brown capsid showed up in their feces. So really strong evidence that they are actually doing the service, and that it's not just one species that's doing it. It's basically, if you eat insects, you eat brown capsid. So that's pretty encouraging for management, that you can, as long as you get abundance volume of insectivores into your farm, you'll be in pretty good shape. Then we wanted to quantify this. We wanted to say how much did they save farmers. So we set up this exclusion experiment where we put bamboo poles and made a net around, so we can compare cocoa trees with and without birds and bats. So basically, in the sunny farms, we found 4 times more large pods on control trees with the birds and bats. So that results in $800 per hectare per year in savings. So there's a huge savings here, but it's dependent on the level of shade. Now, we also got a cool bonus result that I didn't expect, and we just had a PhD student get a fellowship at Durham to study this in detail. So we found, kind of by surprise, that a bunch of the different species were eating Anopheles mosquitoes. And of course, this is the genus that causes malaria. There's like 3 or arguably more species of Anopheles that cause human malaria and kill many people a year, mostly young kids. So it's a really serious problem in sub-Saharan Africa, as you know. So 10% of the diet samples of Rhinolophus alcyone, this one bat, 16% of Hippocedarus ruber, and likewise evidence from one of my favorites, the wattle-eye. So it's a chestnut. Chesterumpti Philothia castanea, which I think they changed the genus of, but 22% of those samples. So these are preliminary, and we have many more samples. And our next step here is to design a primer, a DNA primer that works at the species level for the mosquitoes. This one works just at the genus levels, but we don't know if it's the specific species of Anopheles that is causing, that carries human malaria, if that makes sense. But that's complicated because the bits of DNA in the bird feces are really quite small because they get broken up by digestion. So we need to find basically a DNA primer that works for little pieces of DNA and is species specific, and it takes quite a lot of work in the lab. And basically to get the message back out of some of our findings and how this can sort of help management out. We've been doing a really huge series of farmer workshops with the Waterloo Foundation's help. This is Dr. Melanie Chumbo. She's now doing a postdoc in Lithuania. And she reached like 984 different farmers in like 40 villages to give them, really work with them, understand what their needs are, understand how she can help, and return various times to give different workshops that will cater towards their needs, to help them not only to manage their crops in a way that doesn't destroy the environment, but also to do so in a way that promotes birds and bats that eat pests and promotes sort of a more sustainable ecosystem. And she was like inundated with requests to continue to come back and give additional workshops, and we're hoping that we can pass the system. So she had basically an assistant, Romerick, who worked a little more on the management side rather than biodiversity side, but Crinan, Ellie's colleague, is in touch with him to see if we can transfer some of these workshops over to the Ivory Coast, to Cote d'Ivoire, and deliver this sort of operation over there. Pretty exciting stuff. Okay, so yeah, again, I think I need to go back to Asamba Christian here and his family, and sort of reiterate that what our dream is a win-win-win, right? A win for Asamba, a win for biodiversity, and I guess a win for biologists. That the system is sustainable through and through. That it's sustainable economically. That the farmers continue to make money and don't burn out their farms by planting it in the full sun and having the trees die really soon. It's sustainable socially, so that these folks make a good living wage, ideally through a certification process, and that they are able to that they can control the pest outbreaks and do so sustainably without such a heavy boom and bust cycle like we see when it's totally cacao in the full sun, and sustainable biologically, so that they can that the shade trees that they put into their farms will also help to get the right birds and bats in there and have a really healthy functional ecosystem in and around their farms. That's really the dream. So, okay, I'd like to bring it home with a few messages. So insectivorous birds, I hope I convince you, are excellent indicators of rainforest health, the canaries in the coal mine. This we really knew quite well from the neotropics, but has been not very well quantified in Africa, and we're really trying to, in sub-Saharan Africa anyway, Central Africa, we're trying to really nail that down with some of these studies. They seem to have pretty consistent results among studies and in different locations. It's the ant-following birds that are most sensitive. Cocoa is really diverse, but it is not a substitute for primary forest. It can be used almost certainly as a really nice buffer around big blocks of forest or a corridor in between. And it has a ton of different animals in it, but it is missing the key rainforest specialists like the ant-following birds. And of course, many birds and bats and insects, they consume cocoa pests and they pollinate cocoa, and that saves farmers a good amount of money. So imagine $800 per hectare per year. That's a huge sum for someone that lives below the poverty line in Cameroon, as most of our local collaborators did. And I do believe we can really manage tropical forests with win-wins. The human population is going to really increase. It is increasing, and the more we understand the ecosystem in depth, like the more sort of power we'll have to manage biodiversity and to coexist with nature. And really now is the moment for conservation in Africa. The time is right, the need is there, the desire is there locally, and the situation and really is critical. Thank you so much for your attention.
Maintenant en français, alors je vais aller assez vite. J'ai pas réussi à tout noter parce que la présentation était rapide aussi. Donc, Luc a commencé par démontrer que les hotspots de biodiversité, elles étaient souvent, enfin principalement dans les forêts tropicales, qui disparaissent principalement à cause de la déforestation. Il a aussi surligné qu'en Afrique, c'est surtout de la déforestation qui est due à de l'agriculture à petite échelle, pas pour des grandes plantations comme au Brésil, par exemple. Et que comme l'Afrique, elle est sujette à une croissance démographique très forte, avec la population qui va quadrupler d'ici la fin du siècle, la pression sur les écosystèmes naturels, elle va aussi augmenter de manière exponentielle. Donc ouais, ça va impacter encore plus ces forêts tropicales. Dans les forêts tropicales, Luc, il s'intéresse surtout aux oiseaux insectivores, surtout ceux des sous-bois, parce que ce sont les espèces les plus sensibles, les premières qui disparaissent. Donc, elles sont des espèces qui sont excellentes pour la bioindication. Et on voit qu'elles déclinent même dans les forêts primaires, tellement elles sont sensibles. Après, il a présenté son premier projet en Guinée équatoriale. Du coup, il parle brièvement que les forêts en Afrique centrale, surtout au bassin du Congo, elles sont quand même mieux préservées que celles d'Afrique de l'Ouest, et que c'est la deuxième plus grande forêt, en fait, ou forêt continue, on pourrait dire, après la forêt amazonienne. Il a mentionné la création d'un nouveau parc national. Ils ont reçu des financements pour ça, à côté de la nouvelle capitale, donc en Guinée équatoriale. Ils ont déjà découvert beaucoup d'espèces de mammifères rares à l'intérieur, comme des gorilles, pangolins ou chimpanzés, et énormément d'espèces d'oiseaux. Et il a montré les résultats préliminaires d'une étude où on voit que certaines espèces, enfin, il compare les forêts primaires et secondaires, et on voit que la composition des communautés d'espèces d'oiseaux sont différentes dans ces deux types de forêts, et que plusieurs espèces persistent uniquement dans les forêts primaires, tellement elles sont sensibles. Donc c'est vraiment important de préserver ces forêts primaires. Et pourquoi elles sont si sensibles? Il a expliqué que c'est principalement à cause des fourmis d'Orilus, qui forment les immenses collines de fourmis, les plus grandes parmi les fourmis. Et du coup, elles donnent énormément de nourriture. Et aussi, elles sont des ingénieurs de l'écosystème. Elles modifient tout l'écosystème des sous-bois. Donc, énormément d'espèces dépendent de la présence de ces fourmis. Ensuite, il a changé un petit peu de sujet. Et là, on va au Cameroun pour parler du cacao. Donc, l'Afrique est le premier continent producteur de cacao, surtout l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Mais ça commence aussi en Afrique centrale, notamment au Cameroun. Mais il y a très peu d'études dans ces régions qui s'intéressent à la biodiversité dans les plantations de cacao en Afrique. Donc après, il a présenté les résultats du doctorat de Crinan. En fait, il nous avait présenté aussi ces résultats il y a quelques semaines à Friday for Birds. Et du coup, Crinan a démontré que les plantations de cacao ombragées, donc qui ont toujours un couvert de grands arbres, elles ont plus d'espèces d'oiseaux que quand les plantations de cacao sont faites juste au soleil. On a enlevé ces arbres. Mais que malgré tout, les forêts primaires protègent nettement plus d'espèces d'oiseaux et certaines espèces ne sont retrouvées que dans les forêts primaires. Après, il a parlé plutôt des services écosystémiques que les chauves-souris et les oiseaux dans ces plantations de cacao peuvent fournir aux producteurs, parce qu'ils peuvent agir comme agents de biocontrôle contre les espèces ravageurs ou pour la pollinisation. Donc pour ça, ils ont fait du metabarcoding avec l'ADN et ils ont d'abord démontré qu'il y avait plusieurs espèces de mouches qui étaient responsables pour la pollinisation du cacao et que plusieurs espèces d'oiseaux et de chauves-souris se nourrissent de ravageurs, dont le ravageur principal du cacao, qui est une espèce un interrupteur, une espèce de punaise un peu. Et donc, si on prend tout ça, grâce à la biodiversité et ces services écosystémiques, chaque paysan, chaque producteur de cacao économise 800 dollars, donc 800 euros par an. Je ne sais plus sur quelle surface c'est, je n'ai pas eu le temps de noter. Donc, il pourra reconfirmer après si jamais. Il a aussi montré que plusieurs espèces d'oiseaux et de chauves-souris se nourrissent de moustiques anopheles. Donc, ce sont les espèces qui sont responsables de transmettre la malaria. Donc, il y a peut-être aussi un enjeu intéressant dans cette direction. Ensuite, Luc a aussi organisé des workshops pour les producteurs de cacao afin de les sensibiliser à préserver la biodiversité et ces services écosystémiques qui lui sont associés. Il y a eu de très bons retours avec ces workshops. Et son but ultime, c'est d'avoir un système qui puisse bénéficier autant les producteurs de cacao et leurs familles et la biodiversité. Ça passerait certainement par une certification pour avoir voilà, un système durable qui puisse fonctionner. Du coup, son message final, c'était il faut se souvenir que les insectivores, les oiseaux insectivores des sous-bois sont les meilleurs bioindicateurs des forêts tropicales, que les plantations de cacao, elles peuvent servir, enfin quand elles sont cultivées avec des arbres, donc à l'ombre, elles peuvent servir un peu pour conserver la biodiversité, mais elles ne remplacent pas les forêts primaires. Et que la biodiversité, à son tour, sert les producteurs de cacao par ses services écosystémiques et que maintenant, c'est le moment du coup d'agir dans ces régions pour justement trouver un système qui puisse bénéficier autant les populations locales et la biodiversité. Donc,